As we talk more and more about macroeconomic policy, we will use a framework that helps us conceptualize various types of interactions. The primary graphical version of this is looking at aggregate demand and supply, where we'll have price of the economy as a whole on one axis and real GDP, that is GDP adjusted for price levels or inflation, on the horizontal axis. So I want to start with a discussion about the aggregate demand curve. And in order to pursue that, we're going to be using concepts about the aggregate price level, or inflation, if you will, changes over time, the relationship between bond prices and interest rates, the real money supply, the money supply adjusted for the price level, as well as the definition for aggregate demand, which is going to be consumption plus investment plus government spending on goods and services. And in an open economy context, you will have net exports as well, exports minus imports of goods and services. Now, in an earlier video, kind of set that one aside. That's really part of an international course. So I'm going to take that away, but I want you to keep that aspect in mind, because the international component is a very important part of this process as well. Okay, the aggregate demand curve tells you the economy-wide demand for goods and services by consumers, businesses, and the government at different aggregate price levels. And we depict that with real GDP on this axis and the price level on this axis, and then you have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Now, students invariably, or I should say invariably, many students will look at this and say, oh, well, it's like a demand curve for wheat. Price goes up, your quantity demand goes down, where this was the price of wheat and the quantity of wheat. This is a bit different. So don't get those confused. This is it looks the same, but it's a different set of relationships that underlie this aggregate demand curve. Okay. So let's want to have an idea about the relationship between this price level, this would be like the CPI index, and GDP. And let's imagine we've got some particular level of prices for the economy as a whole and an associated GDP. We'll call that Y. So GDP being the real level of economic activity, GDP adjusted for price. So just pick that combination out of the air. Now let's imagine that the price level has fallen to P2. Be clear, this is the prices of everything changing in the economy by the same amount. So it's just an overall lower price level. Now, let's think about how that would affect the demand for goods and services. And there are really two sources of effects that I want to talk about. One is a so-called wealth effect. As people feel wealthier, they're going to be willing to spend more on goods and services. Okay, if you suddenly get an inheritance, you've got twice as much wealth, you'll spend more. Now, how does a change in the price level change how people feel about their wealth. Well, if you have lower prices overall, then the resources that you do have will be able to purchase more. Okay? So lower prices overall will make you, in effect, wealthier, even if your wealth hasn't changed in nominal terms. Okay? You have more resources. That combination of lower prices and a wealth effect means there will be more demand for goods and services as people feel wealthier. So, you give me a lower overall price, there will be an increase in the demand for goods and services by consumers who feel wealthier. Okay, so that's one source of increased demand with lower prices. The other is a little bit trickier, is an interest rate effect. Okay, so this has multiple steps, so bear with me. We talked before about how the real money supply, the purchasing power of the money that you have circulating in the economy, is measured by the number of bits of currency in circulation divided by the overall price level. How does this real money supply change when you have falling prices? Okay, the thing in the denominator gets smaller, so the overall ratio will go up. The cash that people have in their pockets is worth more. Now, I want to keep in mind that this increase in the value of the currency is not the same thing as the wealth effect. Okay, the wealth effect is this accumulated set of assets. Money supply is the amount of currency in circulation. Now, these are clearly related, but it's not the same thing. As the money supply, the real money supply increases, money has more purchasing power. Savers will buy more bonds. Okay, if you go back and you look at the bond prices and the bond market videos, you will see that they, as people have more funds to loan, they'll say, I'll go buy some bonds and get some interest payments. The purchase of more bonds means that the price of bonds decreases and interest rates, so the price of bonds increases and the interest rate falls. Now, you need to go back and look at that basic concepts video to get to understand that, perhaps. So what you have is pressure for the interest rate charged to borrowers falls. So, lower interest rates, cheaper to expand a factory, cheaper to buy a house, cheaper to borrow for a house, cheaper to borrow to buy a car. All of this results, these lower interest rates tends to increase output as well. The bottom line with this is that these, the lower prices will work through at least these two effects to have a lower price associated with more demand. Now, if you have an international part to this, the lower domestic prices make your goods more attractive internationally. So all things equal, you'll be able to export more if your domestic prices for your goods tends to fall. Okay. Now, if your prices go up, it's exactly the opposite effect. If the price level goes up, your wealth goes down, you buy less, demand for goods and services goes down. Okay. If prices go up, the real value of the money that you have on hand goes down. You'll try and accumulate more money for transactions, if you will. There will be less purchase of bonds. Price of bonds falls, interest rates go up, means less investment. So you have this basic negative relationship between the price level and aggregate demand. Very important. Now, as with any economics course, we also want to think about what will shift this aggregate demand curve. What would mean that the whole thing shifts, not a movement along the curve, but really for any given level of prices, you would have a change in the demand by consumers, government, investors. Well, one, changing consumer confidence. At any price level, if people are suddenly more optimistic about the future and say, I think things are going to be great, I'm going to increase what I buy because I think I'm going to have a great job next year, or finally the political situation has gotten stable or whatever, you might have an increase in aggregate demand associated with increase in consumption. If you had rising investment because of business confidence, investors now believe that things are going to be great. That can increase investment, a component of aggregate demand, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. If you have an increase in government spending or lower taxes, that will also increase aggregate demand. So actually, maybe I shouldn't put lower taxes in there. So the third component of aggregate demand, increase in government spending, also shift aggregate demand. Now, why did I raise taxes? If you think about lowering taxes, that really, if it's lower taxes on consumers, that really affects the consumption part, not the government spending part. Okay? And a change in net exports, again, this is really more for the international component of your studies. That also, if you have an increase in exports, maybe a foreign country is booming, shift in the aggregate demand. So it's very important that you have a sense of what will move you along the demand curve. It's change in prices, price level. These things will change, shift the aggregate demand. So when we start to talk about macroeconomic policy, recessions, and so forth, you're often going to be talking about changes in these things that will cause a shift.